So my name is Mark Kerry. I'm going to talk about maples tonight. I've been into bonsai as a hobby for probably about 17 years. And like most people, got a house, got a garden, and just got fascinated by little bonsai trees. Started off with little Chinese elms from B&Q, that sort of thing, and progressed into bigger and more wonderful trees as I've gone along. I'm the chairman of Newbury and District Bonsai Society, and I'm also a member of Swindon as well. So some people have seen me around shows and chatted to me, so that's a brief background to me. Okay, so why maples? And the reason I like them is they give so much to me throughout the year. They're very rewarding tree. In spring, as we'll see now, you get beautiful colours and the fresh new leaves. They look good through spring, through summer, and then again they give a very great colour in autumn. And then winter, if you're looking after them well, you get to see hopefully a very nice silhouette to the tree and its winter image. So I think they give so much through the year, so that's why I personally like them as a species for bonsai. So I'll just talk through roughly what we're going to go through today, talk about the species care, what sort of things you should be doing at certain times of the year, talk about pruning and ramification of trees and how to improve that, how to propagate them so you can make more trees to keep going. Talk about some more advanced techniques as well that maybe are less commonly used. Talk about pests and diseases that we get with the species. Then I'll show you some very pretty pictures of bonsai styles, the types of tree that you can grow and the shapes. Talk about pot selection and what works well with maples. Talk a little bit towards the end about different varieties you can use. It's not just the Japanese maple or the trident maple, there are other ones we can use. Then I'll talk a little bit about what a good resource is for when you talk about maples and bonsai. And then at the end, we can open up to questions. I'm very happy to answer your questions then. So if we talk about species care, if we're talking about the position in the garden that you want to keep these trees, they can tolerate full sun, maples, especially if they're healthy. There's a bit of a sort of myth really that maples have to be in partial shade. Not always. What I find is worse for maples is wind and sun together, because that will lead to a lot of moisture loss from the leaves. And then you can see here on the right sort of crisp leaves, and that's the sort of thing you get. Now my maples are out in full sun all the day and I don't really need any shade, and that's really good plant husbandry, that they have good root system and can support the amount of transpiration that you get in summer. It's not that windy in my back garden. If it was a very exposed area for wind, you may need a little bit of care and to stop this kind of leaf scorching going along. But I think it's really just learning what works in your garden for the trees. If they do start crisping it like this, it's either that it is just too windy, or maybe it just signifies that you've got a little bit of a root problem going on and that there's not enough roots actively supporting all the leaves that you've got in those conditions. So we want to just look at whether your roots are healthy enough. If we talk about the soils that we use, me personally, I use Akadama, either neat or with a little bit of Kiryu, which is like pumice type material that still holds a little bit of moisture, but is more freer draining than Akadama. What you really want to do is avoid any root rot in trees, and that comes from having poorly draining soil that starts to cause the roots to stagnate and rot, and that's where you really get a lot of your problems, not just in maples but in trees in general. You want to avoid overwatering, so a lot of that you get around by using this kind of Akadama mix. And you know, I personally like it. Over time it can break down if you go through a freeze-thaw cycle, but if you repot your trees every 2-3 years, that shouldn't be a major issue. And for me, maples are filling the pots certainly over that time, Trident maples are literally filling the pot with roots after the first year and may need to be repotted every single year. In terms of timing for repotting, obviously it's all over and done with now for this year, but I personally do it when the buds are starting to swell. I've even started to go into doing it a little bit later when actually some leaves are just starting to show, and it seems to be working fine. I like to do it as close to active growth as possible, because if you're repotting and cutting the roots at that time, you're doing some damage to the tree. And if the tree is starting to grow, it'll start to heal. Now, if you did repotting at the start of winter, just after it's lost its leaves, it'll just be sitting there really not healing itself. So I like to do it in spring, just as it's starting to grow, and get all the repotting done then. You can do quite drastic root pruning. On ordinary maples, Japanese maples, you can remove quite a bit of the root if need be. In terms of trident maples, because they're so vigorous, you can actually remove even more root if you want to start to get a better root system. You can get rid of some of those big structural roots as long as there's enough root mass left. And in some cases with maples, especially ones that I buy in that have either got poor soil or never really been repotted by me, so I don't know what's in the root mass, I actually take a hose pipe to the roots and can root ball them, and they seem to behave well after that. It just allows you to see what you're pruning and how to improve the roots. I'll talk a little bit about root improvement later. I think that's one area in bonsai that sometimes is a little bit overlooked, because it's quite a delicate process, taking a tree out of its pot and repotting it. And I think some people get a little bit scared and rush that procedure, when really if you're misting the roots that are there, you can actually have it out of a pot for a reasonable amount of time and do quite a lot of work to it. So I think it's one of those areas where you'll get a lot of improvement in the tree longer term, but it's also one of the hardest bits of a tree to improve, those roots and the nabari. Branches you can grow over several years, but it takes you quite a long time to get a really good root base. And if you do that earlier in the tree's evolution, then you get the best results, but you need to know how to do that. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. In terms of feeding, when the tree's active, you can start feeding. You can start, obviously this isn't a maple, it's a pine, but you can add things in baskets to stop birds are disturbing them. Me personally, I use a slow release fertilizer. I actually use a Japanese one called Naruko, which I believe is a mixture of sort of a chemical and an organic fertilizer. And it releases the chemical first of all, and then over the next month, it releases the organic slower, so you can actually give that less often than you would with a traditional organic fertilizer. So usually you want to start growing, start when the tree is growing and feeding it. Don't feed it when it's just been repotted. You want to give it a good, I would say, 4 to 6 weeks before you start feeding, and then gradually bring it in. The reason you avoid feeding that early when you've repotted is that when you've cut the roots, it'll start putting out new, very fine root hairs, and they're very susceptible to being burnt by chemical fertilizer that you're putting on there, and it can damage those and set the tree back. So you want to make sure that the tree's settled and it's put all that very tender growth out and it's hardened off a little bit in terms of the roots. Watering, as I've already said, you want to water quite well, especially in summer when it's very hot, especially if you've got a fairly free draining substrate like akadama, but you don't want the trees to stand in water for a prolonged period of time. So I personally, that's why I use akadamas. I don't need to worry about it. You can't really overwater water too much with akadama as long as it's not breaking down. In terms of winter care, you can keep trees, maples out all over winter as long as they don't get below -10 degrees. That's Japanese maples. Me personally, I keep them in an unheated greenhouse with a little bit of insulation. That's just me probably being a little bit more paranoid, and also giving them a bit of an earlier start in spring. Just prolongs the growing season a little bit. Trident maples, though, aren't frost hardy. They can be damaged if you allow them to get frost. So if you're unsure about whether a tree is frost tolerant or not, first thing is look it up if you can. There's some really good resources like Bonsai for Me. He's got Good Species Guide. The other thing is have a look at the roots. If anyone's got a trident maple, when you repot it, you can tell that the roots are very fleshy. It's the same for things like Cryptomeria and also yews. If you look at them, they're very fleshy and not very barky, the roots. And that's why they're not tolerant to frost. You know, when you've got a water in a tree's roots that freezes, it'll expand and it'll damage those roots, and those roots aren't strong enough to tolerate that kind of frost expanding. So don't overwater them in winter. Make sure that you keep them moderately moist but not too wet, because you can promote root rot. It's always good practice to remove any dead leaves once they've fallen off the tree, just because you can get sort of fungal spores just sitting near to the roots, and also you can overwinter some bugs as well, which you don't want to be doing. And protect your trees from frost. Now, at the moment, it's a real pain in the backside. It's kind of in and out of the greenhouse. I'm sure a lot of you are in a similar position, where the trees themselves in terms of roots are tolerant, but the new growth will not tolerate any frost. And like for the last week, we've been close to freezing, haven't we? So, you know, it's not worth the risk. I've had them in and out of the greenhouse all the time, just to make sure that that new growth doesn't get damaged, and it just sets the tree back if you do that. It will recover if it's a healthy tree, but if you damage that initial growth with frost, it's got to regrow it, so it'll just deplete the energy within the tree as it tries to regrow a second set of leaves. In terms of wiring, you can wire maples. There's no reason you can't, but sometimes it's better to go with a clip and grow method. So what that is, if you don't know, is you just let the tree grow. So this is an extreme example on a trident maple, where you've let it grow to this kind of thickness, and then you've got a side branch here that then becomes a new leader, and you make your cut across here. So you can do exactly the same for all the branches as well. And in theory, you don't need to wire a tree at all. Practically, you may want to wire from time to time, but the things to watch out for with wiring is that they can expand quite quickly, the shoots and the branches, and then the wire might cut in, and then it's quite unsightly. And because it's quite thin bark on a maple, it won't, it'll show for quite a while. It's like you have with Japanese beeches and other trees like that. It's quite noticeable when you have wire marks on those trees. It's very difficult for them to recover from that and not show it. The other thing as well is sometimes when you wire, not to be too contrived in making quite bendy shapes. Looking at this where it has been wired, that's okay, but any more than that, it looks a little bit false if you're wiring it and bending it to of a contorted angle. So that's sometimes why clip and grow method is slightly better, because it gives you more angular junctions. In terms of pruning, you can do minor pruning for most of the year. The times when you don't want to do that is in early spring, when the sap flow is strongest, because you'll get a lot of bleeding. So what I do is, if I'm doing the winter pruning, as I did this year, just before trees are starting to wake up, just prune one branch that you want to get rid of, or a twig, and then leave it for about 5 or 10 minutes and just see if you're actually getting the sap bleeding out of that tree. And if it does bleed quite a lot, then I would leave that pruning until the first set of leaves have come out and they're starting to harden off. The problem with sap loss is it just weakens the tree. It's losing moisture out of those, and also nutrients and things like that are being pushed out of the tree. So you want to try and avoid that. It's also quite difficult to stop that bleeding, even with cut paste. if you do get excessive bleeding, the only way really to do it is actually blowtorch on the end of your branch to stop it. So try and avoid that. And I got caught out this year because a lot of my trees are, I've now gone back to wooden boxes and quite shallow ones. What I found in those, they must be getting so strong that it's quite a big surge in spring. So one of my maples, a very small one, I was going to do a major cut and go to a new leader. And in February, I thought, oh, I'll have a look and just prune it. And even then, it was just pushing out a whole load of sap. So it shows the tree's very strong, but the buds weren't moving at all. And it surprised me quite a bit. So it's always best to just check first before you start to prune the trees, just to see if they're going to bleed. It is easier to prune to a silhouette when it's out of leaf, because when it's in leaf you can't see the structure of the tree. So that's why winter pruning is quite good to do that in very early spring, before the trees start, or late winter. You can prune to the shape you want. Personally, I don't like doing major pruning, like removing a major branch, until the tree is actually actively growing. It comes back to this philosophy I've got of, you want to have the tree healing itself. If you do it in winter, it's not going to callus over, it's not really going to do anything. So there's no point to me to do it at that particular point. I'd rather wait till it's actually actively growing and it can recover. So what you'll need to do with those, if you want to remove a major branch, is to mark it up either with a little bit of paint or with a bit of string or something, so you know what you actually want to remove. Because when it's fully in leaf, if you've got quite a big tree, sometimes it's difficult to work out what you wanted to remove in the first place. So that's the way to do that. When you are doing pruning, you should always seal your cuts. It's better for them, they heal better personally, or that's the way I find it. Some people think you don't need that and have good results without it. But for me personally, I always like to seal the cuts, and I get a nice even callousing, and it doesn't show so much when you've got the branch removed. Because the whole idea is you're trying to remove a branch and make it look like there's nothing there. So if you've got some cut paste on where you've cut it, it keeps the area moist a little bit and it helps to callus it quicker. So it just closes up a little bit quicker, in my opinion. Now you can also defoliate either fully or partially Japanese maples or trident maples. To me, I don't fully defoliate any of my trees anymore. I used to, but I find that it's a little bit too draining on the energy reserves of a tree. If a tree is very healthy, you can get away with full defoliation. But to me, I've gone over to more of a partial defoliation and removing the outer canopy, and that helps support the growth that's inside. So that's the growth that you're leaving on the inside of a tree. So me personally, I don't fully defoliate, I partially defoliate my trees. And again, I'll talk a little bit more in depth on that when we get onto the pruning bit. So what should we be doing at what time of year? So you want to be repotting around February or March. Very much depends on the actual maple species itself. I've got a couple of Kia Hime maples that are exceptionally early. You know, the Swindon show, I quite often display at that, and that's in the 3rd to 4th week in Feb, and it's almost always out in leaf for that show, or just starting to come into leaf. So that's very early. Some of my other maples come out a little bit later, but the reason I suppose that I'm getting that kind of growth around February is because I'm protecting it a little bit in the greenhouse. If I kept it outside, I might be able to hold it back for a few more weeks and have it completely out of leaf for the show. You should also start feeding unless you've just repotted a tree. So when you've got the active growth, start feeding. One thing I am toying with a little bit now is holding back a little bit the feeding for the initial flush, just because if you're feeding while it's doing that initial flush, you get longer internodes and more growth. So if you're trying to bring on a tree to grow it quickly and to develop it, then you probably want to be feeding very early in the year and get that growth so it thickens the trunk. If you're looking to maintain a tree that's very, very well developed, then maybe you want to think about not feeding quite so early, so the initial flush is a little bit shorter internodes, and then start feeding a little bit later in the year, maybe sort of April, May, rather than right at the very start of the year. So I've just started to go over to that. Whether that's going to have those kind of results, you know, I'll obviously have to wait and see. But there's enough time, even if you're starting to feed in April, May, for it to get the energy through the year with photosynthesis, etc. Summer and autumn, you want to carry on feeding and pruning. You want to do that up until probably around about August is the latest. The reason being, first of all, if you're using an organic fertilizer, you've got to realize that it keeps going for probably a couple of months. So you may want to actually remove that at that point, or just stop maybe in July, giving any more feed. But the reason you want to stop at that kind of time in the year is because you may get a late surge of growth, especially with something like a trident maple, which can have several flushes of growth through the year. If you've got very young, tender growth as you're going into towards winter, then you might just get frost damage and lose the whole of those shoots. So I always like to ease off a little bit. I don't feed over winter at all. I don't use low nitrogen feed. Some people do, but I don't find any need for it. In winter, as we've already mentioned, you want to water very sparingly. Don't feed, and protect it from frosts if required. Definitely trident maples. Japanese maples, I tend to just give them a little bit of extra protection, but I have ones that are outside as well, and they are perfectly happy as well. So we'll go on to pruning now. So apologies for people who are well versed in bonsai and have done this, because it's going to be fairly obvious to you. But for people who haven't, I'll just give you a very brief idea of what we're trying to do when we prune a tree, especially a deciduous tree. So you can see here in this example A, you've got a shoot that's been growing out this year, and it's growing outwards. Now it's strongest in this area at the tip. This is called the apical area, and it's pushing all of its growth out here. And if you didn't do anything to this tree, it would just keep going and keep going. And what would happen is these ones here, which are closer to maybe the trunk, they would start to die off because it doesn't need those. These are kind of all little bits of insurance policy if you could lose something at this end of the tree. You know, once you've got a tree that's got enough leaf surface area, no matter where it is, then it doesn't maybe need some of these ones here, and it doesn't support them. And we in bonsai have to try and fight that. We need to make sure that the tree stays small, and you're really going against the tree's natural habit to do that. So that's why we need to use techniques like pruning to redirect the growth within a tree. So what you do in spring or early summer, when you've got a long enough shoot, is cut it off at whatever point you want to cut it off at. And then what will happen is, in these areas here, you'll have dormant buds at the base of both of these stalks, and then those will then grow. Because what you do when you cut in here is it changes the hormone balance within the tree, and it sort of sends signals that these dormant buds have to be activated and grow into new shoots. So that's exactly why we do it. And you get this new growth, so that's all great. But the second part of the equation that sometimes people don't think about is reducing the growth on the outer canopy. So it's not just enough to get shorten these shoots as they're coming out in the new growth. You need to think about what the net result is. So if you're cutting here, cutting here, and you get these new growth out here with quite a lot of leaf mass, you also maybe get some shoots back here. Now, if there's too much growth in the outer canopy, these will die off. And you'll see that in winter. If you've got a maple that's dropped all its leaves, you'll see some shoots on the inside. that are no longer alive. They grew out to maybe a couple of centimeters, and then they just dry out and die. And it's because there's not enough light hitting them, and also maybe there's too much growth on the outside. It doesn't need them. So what we're trying to do is keep as much of the inner growth as possible for several reasons. One is it just gives you a more refined tree, gives you denser foliage and denser twigs. The other thing as well is ultimately these branches at the end are going to have to be replaced at some point in the future. They'll grow too thick for the tree itself. No matter how well you keep it pruned, they'll thicken over time. And what you'll need to do is start thinking about, well, if this branch is getting too big over time, you need to maybe replace it with something coming out a little bit further back. So that's why it's really important to keep this inner growth going, so you can either replace it or just have an overall very densely ramified tree. Spring growth, you can sometimes get quite a big flush and you can get long nodes. As I've been talking before about feeding, sometimes you can reduce that a little bit by feeding. Being a little bit careful about how much you water, maybe not overwatering too much, that can have an effect as well. Because ultimately what we want is fairly small nodes, just the area between one set of leaves and the next one. So that's a node there. So if that's very short on a small tree, it looks better. If you've got a very, very long node, it doesn't look so good because it's just bare branch. You won't get any shoots from between the two nodes. So really I find that there's two methods to be able to get short nodes on a tree. One is to allow the tree to do its first flush and grow, and then think about most of that growth that's there as a little bit expendable. And when you do your pruning, you get rid of that initial growth, and then you get the secondary flush. And the secondary flush is smaller, it's shorter nodes, and that's because you've depleted some of the initial energy that the trees got from winter. You know, from all last year's growth, it's built up its energy reserves and it pushes it all out in spring. And that sometimes means the nodes are too long to practically use. So one way of doing it is you cut them and get the secondary growth, which is smaller. There's another way, which I'll talk about as well, which is the shoot pinching, just taking out the very young shoot tip. And that's a Japanese technique called Metsumi. I'll talk about that in a minute. I think it's worth pointing out here something that when you're coming new into the hobby that you may not realize. There are points in the year that your trees are not going to look very good. Certainly for something like maples when they're growing out, you've got longer shoots sometimes. You may want to thicken a branch up. You know, I've got some trees that my neighbours must think I'm a complete loony because I've got some branches that are 3 foot long on some of my maples as they're trying to thicken up. But that's the quickest way to thicken a branch. I don't want to wait 10 years to get a branch the right size. I want to do it in 2 or 3 years. And the consequence of that is I let a shoot grow very vigorously and I don't cut it. So it's the thickness I need. So I think it's just getting into a mindset that sometimes your tree's not going to look good all the way through the year. You know, if you're trying to get to that, it's unrealistic to me. I think it's best to get a tree to grow as well as it can and to get to a final image quicker. And that will mean you may need to have these shoots growing off in all directions, or you may need to remove a lot of the outer canopy during spring and summer, which I'll talk about in a minute. But that means it's slightly less pretty for some of summer, but to me, I know I'm going to reap the rewards in winter when I look at it out of leaf. And to me, that's the real beauty of a deciduous tree, is when it's out of leaf in winter. You know, throughout the year, they're very pretty, but the real skill and the art is being able to have a very well ramified tree at the end of the year. Okay, so let's go into a little bit more detail about what I'm talking about with trying to prune and get this shorter secondary growth and building up ramification.
So we've got a branch here. It's quite a simplistic view. Got some little blue dots. Now they either show the buds, where you're going to have quite strong buds at the end of a branch, or you may have some further back. So this is what I'm talking about. I've just drawn where the nodes are here. Ones further back, you might not actually be able to see a bud at all, but there'll be a very small, almost microscopic bud in there that can be activated when you prune. So what happens first during spring is you get growth from some of these. From ones that are at the end of branches, you'll get longer growth, and you'll get maybe several pairs of leaves. So I've not drawn the leaves in just for clarity, but this is where the leaves will be, and also there will be buds at these points. You can also find, because this is right at the very end of a branch, you've got a branch that's growing a very long node. So as you can see there, really we want that to be a bit smaller than that at that point. So you want to cut appropriately, and I'll show you that now. So what you want to do is, after you've got that first flush and the tree's just starting to harden off its leaves, so they're not quite so fragile, they're maybe a little bit stronger when you feel the leaves, you can then do this pruning and just make these cuts. You want to make a cut probably at the first set of leaves. This one here I've marked particularly because you've got a very long node. You don't really want to keep this. So actually, if you remove that entirely, what you're going to do is activate a bud at the base of that shoot, and it will shoot again and it'll be shorter. What you'll find is some of these inner shoots are quite weak and are quite short. So actually you might have a good node length already there. So there's maybe no need to prune these. If they get a little bit longer on the inside, then maybe you do want to prune them. But it's really just a judgment call when you're pruning about how far you need to go. So what happens when you prune all of these, as I showed before, is the tree sends signals to these more dormant buds, and you get what happens here. So this is in red, the second flush, and what happens after you've pruned. Either the first node, or for long nodes, you maybe want to go right back and eliminate all that initial growth. So you get hopefully short growth where you've cut that one off entirely, and it's more in proportion with the end of the branch. This one here, you've got two new shoots that have come from these two buds that you've cut back to, and then you get the similar sort of growth here towards all the outer shoots. Inside, because you've not pruned these, you might get a little bit more extension, or it might just stay as it is. It might not grow anymore, but because you've redistributed the hormones within the tree, this growth is more likely to survive and not be dropped. The other thing you'll get is you'll get growth much further back on the tree, and all these dormant buds are now starting to come out. And these are really important. These are the ones you want to try and cultivate over time, and either replace the tree or just grow them into branches and get a very ramified tree. But because these are quite weak and you've got a lot of other growth, if you don't remove the outer leaves and let sunshine get onto these, then you've got a chance that they may die off. So part of it is sunshine. So if you get sun on these, it'll encourage them to grow. Also, because if you remove the outer foliage, you're removing less of the tree's energy making mechanisms by photosynthesis. It says, oh, I've got a bit of an imbalance here. I'm not very happy. I'm going to have to make more leaves. And you're forcing it to make more leaves further back by pruning it like this. So that's why the tree responds this way. And that's why, if you want inner growth, you need to do two things. You need to prune the tips, which I think everyone knows, but I think the thing sometimes people forget is to keep that inner growth going, you need to remove some of the outer leaves as well, and to get it to grow the inner leaves and the inner shoots. And what will happen is you get shorter nodes, hopefully, because The initial flush in spring is long and strong. In the second growth that you get later on in spring, early summer, after you've pruned, because it's depleted some of the energy within the tree, you get these shorter nodes. Okay, so the second method, the shoot pinching, it's called Metsumi. And as you can see here, you've got a trident maple with a very young set of leaves in the center. What you can do is pinch those out either with your finger or with tweezers, and it does the same thing. It stops the growth there. Now, the one advantage with this is this shoot is growing, and as it grows, the node length grows with it. So if you get in there as it's just coming out, these leaves, it kind of stops that lengthening of the node. So you'll find that the Japanese do this on really, really well ramified trees. You know, we're talking about the things that go into the Kokofu exhibitions, and they really want to try and hold that tree back as much as possible. So they want ideally a couple of millimeters of growth on the outside canopy every year. So this is one of the techniques that they use to do that. Now, I've done it. I don't have time to do it now with other things I'm doing, so I don't personally use this very much. But if you've got the time to do it, it's a very worthwhile thing doing on very well developed trees, but it is time consuming. You can also get sort of bladed tweezers that allow you to go in and make these cuts. One thing I would say is I think that if you do this for a very long time over the space of many, many years, it may start to weaken the tree because you're not allowing it to have that flush and build up its energy reserves. But if you've got a very well ramified tree that's got a lot of surface area, you may get away with it. But I don't know personally how many years sort of the Japanese will do this on a well ramified tree, and whether they maybe then want to give it a year of free growth before going back to it, or whether they do it continuously. I can imagine it's a little bit draining to the tree very long term. Okay, so I thought it'd be good to summarize just what are good branches and what are not. So hopefully you might have seen this kind of diagram before. I'll just go over some of the branch placings that are not so good. So you've got things like suckers that come from the base. Ideally, you want to eliminate those. The only reason you wouldn't want to eliminate is if you suddenly decided you wanted a twin trunk and you let one of those grow. But generally, you want to get rid of those. You want to get rid of branches that come directly at you. They kind of look like they're about to poke you in the eye, so they're very distracting. Generally, on a deciduous tree or any tree, you want to see a significant portion of the trunk line without a branch right in your face or covering it. So that's why you remove these kind of branches. This one here, it's quite a low branch, which is not always such a problem if you want to have the style, but the big problem here is it's vastly out of proportion with what is the main first branch here. So you want to remove things like that. You want to remove upward or downward growing branches, branches that cross over other ones. It's quite difficult. Sometimes you have to do that on a well ramified tree, but you want to avoid very obvious ones where it's crossing. Same there, strong upward growth across another one. Very contorted, unnatural branch placings. Ones where they're very similar and are almost parallel to each other. Bar branches, where they're at the same level. Very thick growth, very high up the trunk. It's unnatural compared to the rest of the branches around it. Other things are a branch that comes really out of the silhouette of your tree that you're trying to do. Again, growth that's coming back towards the main trunk. So that's the main things you want to try and avoid in terms of branching. Something you may disagree with, but for me, the philosophy behind a good deciduous tree and the reason you want to avoid these things are a lot of them, like bar branches, create symmetry. Same with parallel branches or things that are growing back in. The flow of a tree here is up, out, and nice waves. That is obvious that it doesn't follow that pattern and it draws your eye. And I think with any tree, the trick is to avoid those kind of things that draw your eye in terms of attention to detail, and look at the tree as a whole. I think that gives you a better overall view of the tree. You can stand back and look at it as a whole composition. Whereas if you have got very specific, flaws might be a bit of too strong a word of it, but if you've got certain features in the tree that are very strong, it will draw your eye. And if you're trying to do that for artistic value, then fine. But to me, I prefer a tree that's just quite delicate and a whole image, and nothing individually draws your eye. The same goes for the choice of pot as well. If you've got a very brightly coloured pot, it will draw your eye, and you're not really looking at the whole tree pot as a whole. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So in terms of ramification, so this is a branch that someone's just taken off a fairly well structured maple tree. So I've got a few marks on here just to show you practically what they've done. So they've grown this branch out here to a certain thickness. Then at that point, they've made a cut. And at the point here where there were two leaves, now you've got new shoots. So you've grown into two directions. They've done the same again, grown into two, same again, same again. So that's why you're going from 2 shoots to 4 to 8, and you're building up that ramification in a tree. And as you can see, arguably you've got a fairly long node there, but you want to keep fairly short node lengths and also get shorter towards the outside of a tree. So for example, here you've got a really, that's not too bad a node length, but if you look at these shoots here, that's too long to me. So what I would do on this particular tree is actually cut both of those off after the first flush, and then try growing new shoots from those points, and hopefully you'll have a shorter node length so that it keeps more in keeping with the place within a tree. You can get away with quite long node lengths closer to the branch, but as you're going further and out, they should get smaller and smaller. The same idea behind when you do a tree, it should get shorter distance between the branches as you're going up towards the apex. And just to show you what is achievable when you've got a good technique, you've got this, I believe it's a trident maple from Japan, and that's just fantastic ramification. It's a very high maintenance tree, I'm guessing, but it shows you what is capable when you've got a good technique going. So let's talk a little bit about propagation. You can use all the major techniques. You can use seeds, you can use cuttings. So you can use hardwood cuttings that are thicker, so like pencil thickness shoots that you take those in winter. Typically you do that, take them in sort of winter and just plant them in the ground. That kind of works. In terms of newer growth, you don't want to take the very young growth that's around now. You want to maybe do it in a month or so's time when it's starting to harden off a little bit and the stem is a little bit more rigid than it probably is at the moment. Both hardwood and semi-hardened new growth, they're applicable for cuttings. You can do air layers. It works really well on maples. It allows you to maybe take trees, as I've got in the garden, not maple trees, but just maples, sorry, not maple bonsai, but maple trees in the garden, and create new little trees from them. And you can choose to air layer around maybe a branch or a splitting of the trunk, so you can get a twin trunk. So it's a really useful method for creating new trees, and also creating trees with thicker trunks because it's already been grown on a mature tree. So you want to start that in late spring. I would probably say give it about another 2 weeks to a month before you start doing that. Let the sort of initial growth that we've had this year harden off a little bit before doing the air layers. And you can also do grafting. So if you start to buy maple varieties from garden centres, you'll find very often the named varieties are grafted onto just normal Acer palmatum rootstock. And that's really because some of these varieties are a little bit weak on their own, and putting them on the isopalmatum rootstock just makes them stronger growing. So that's good. The downside is sometimes some of these grafts are not done very well because they're not looking to have a very pretty trunk down there. They're just looking to sell it and someone put it in the ground. So what I would always do if you're looking at a tree from a nursery that's not bonsai nursery is just have a little dig around in the pot and just check whether there's a good graft on there if you can't see it already. Also, it's good just to check if the root flare's good, because it saves you a little bit of hard work there. It's a good thing to know to have a look out for those sort of things and choose a good tree if you want to bonsai some nursery material. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the more advanced techniques that are maybe not used so widely. I think now with a lot of them coming over from Japan where they've been developed, and there's maybe more knowledge because you've either got people taking it up within the bonsai community over here, or you've got some excellent videos on YouTube where people are doing this. So we're going to talk a little bit about improving the nobari. There's several ways to do this. One of them is grafting roots on. So what you can have on a tree is some quite thick roots. And if you let those thicker roots grow out, it doesn't really make you, the tree want to put out some new roots rather, and get sort of a nice spread. So either you prune the larger structural roots a little bit, and then it promotes more growth further back and more new roots, or you can take young maple saplings and just do approach grafting. So the way to do this is just to make a notch in your trunk and then pin essentially a sapling in there and wait for it to start to join and fuse with it, and then at some point you can then cut at say this point, and then you've got a new root. Another way of doing it is thread grafting. So very similar, but what you're doing here is actually drilling a hole through the trunk or through the thicker root, and then adding a shoot in, putting it all the way through, and then as it starts to thicken, it will get infused with the trunk and support itself, and then at that point you can cut off the end of the shoot, and you're left with the root that's supporting the tree and it's growing with the tree because it's now part of it. So the whole idea is to get this very well developed base to a tree where you've got a nice flare out, and you've also got a lot of growth from a lot of different places. And as these start to grow out and thicken, they'll fuse together and you'll get an even wider base. And I'll show you that in a couple of slides time, where you've got very good nobari. So another technique is to grow through a tile. So this is originally from, I think, a Japanese magazine where they showed the technique. What they originally did was just put a cutting through a tile. You can either do one or you can do several. For example, this one's got several through a tile, so you can either make a clump style tree, or you can just grow them, fuse them, and then select one of them and get rid of the rest, and then you've got a very wide base. But they were using cuttings. Now I've done this technique, but I don't use cuttings. I use I don't use brand new cuttings without roots on. I use cuttings that are a year old and have got roots on, because really we don't get the kind of success rate that they do over in Japan. Japan's a different climate with much higher humidity, so they've got a better chance of being able to support the tree, the cutting, and have new roots. So what you can do is take a tile, get your small plant, put it through, and then bury it to this level. What will happen is over subsequent years it will thicken to the size of the tile. When it reaches that point, it will realize that it needs to put out new roots, because what's happening in the tree is you've got a lot of the nutrients coming back down the trunk, and some of those would naturally go into the roots for storage. Because it hasn't got new roots, it creates new ones. So really, this is essentially a ground layering exercise, but it's very similar to air layering. It's cutting off the flow of the cambium going back down the tree, and as a result, the tree's got to put out new roots, and it does that at this kind of point here. And then what you can do is take the tree up, and you'll see you've got lots of well-positioned roots all the way around, all coming out horizontally, which is what you want. And then you can get rid of all of this stuff down the bottom. You can get the tile off and then plant it in a box, let it grow for, well, quite a few more years, let's be frank. But then you can get this very wide growth and this very large root plate. And that all comes from what I was just showing you here. As these grow out, they'll start to fuse together and give you this really wide base. Now, some people like really wide bases, some people don't. It's sometimes a artistic preference. But what you can see here, you might be able to see there's a branch been removed and it's just callousing over. So they may well have used a technique similar to this, where there's lots of branches been growing different places around the trunk and they've removed them. And if you remove them well, over the years, it'll callus in such a way that hopefully you won't even think that there's been a trunk there at that point. So another technique that will give you a good base is what's called, I think, the Ebihara method, after the Japanese guy who's quite famous with maples, and this is one of his trees. I believe this is one of his trees as well. One way that they used to say to improve the roots in a tree is just put it in a pot, and then sometimes maybe use a little bit of wire to move roots around into the right position. What this guy has done is taken it a next step along. So what he's got is a maple trunk here and a wooden block underneath. Now actually there'll be a screw going through the bottom into this trunk to hold it in place, and then with nails, because you've got a wooden block underneath, you can position absolutely all of these roots so they're spread out, so they're coming out almost perpendicular to the trunk, and then it can grow outwards, and eventually you can get this kind of nice flare to a tree. So again, what you want to do is put this either in the ground or in a wooden box. I like wooden boxes. They're relatively cheap. You can make them to whatever size you want, and trees like maples really tend to do well in them. So you want to put it in there and fill it up to a reasonable level, and let the roots grow out. And you want to have a fairly big box, because the further the roots grow outwards, the thicker they become. It's the same for shoots. If you're not letting them grow, they won't thicken. Yeah. So the quickest way to get development on this tree will be to put it in the ground. If you haven't got the space for that, just put it in a fairly big pot. The other thing you'll notice as well is, because it's on a wooden block, all the growth has to go out horizontally. It can't go downwards. So that's another advantage, is you've got a very widespreading set of roots. So obviously this is taking it to quite an extreme root base. My personal taste, I think it's a little bit too big. The other thing as well, I think with this kind of root base, is it can actually be a little bit difficult to water the tree. So you've got to be a little bit careful if you've got this really big bases, because all your shoots around the outside will be fine, and obviously the newer growth is going to be there. But inside, right at the very center, you might actually get quite a dry patch that doesn't get any water. So you've got to be quite careful to water those trees. I was thinking about that before, and the best way to do it, and maybe the best way to do it is actually to have the pots at an angle when you're watering, so that it'll always drain in one direction and hopefully get into the center. But none of my trees are anywhere near quite that well developed, so I don't have to worry about that one at the moment. So another more advanced technique that I've used quite a lot successfully is thread grafting. So this tree here, I believe, is an Arakawa maple, which is a cork bark maple. And they do tend to shed branches from what I understand. I've never had one, but I think they can shed the branches, especially if they're a little bit neglected. So essentially what someone's doing here is taking a trunk with some very long shoots, but not in the right place. These are all around the top, bending them back around to a place where they want new branches. So you can see the placement here. These are placed on the outside. So what someone has done is drilled a hole through and then placed a shoot through. Now, practically when you're doing that, I always drill from the side that you want to come out and then drill through here. The reason that is, you get a nice clean cut here, but generally you'll get some breakout at that end, and this end is less important in terms of having to callus over. So you want to make a hole that's a little bit thicker than the branch you're trying to put through it. You want to do this when the tree is out of leaf, and also when these buds aren't swelling too much. So if you want to do it in winter, you want to do it before the buds start swelling, or the other time to do it is partway through the year, so around the time you do air layers, I would say. And what you want to do is the branch that you're about to put through, you want to defoliate that portion and give it probably about 2-3 weeks before you do this, because that'll allow the buds to thicken up a little bit and get a little bit stronger, but not to start swelling. So you want to do that, push it through, and I also like to put a toothpick or something just above that to push the whole of that branch down to the bottom. Maybe I'll show you a little bit more in here. So when you put it through, you'll have a toothpick at this top part here, and it pushes it towards the bottom. The reason is you want it to support the sort of water flow up the branch that way there. And then you also want to put some cut paste around it as it's starting to form this callus and to join onto the rest of the tree. It's not difficult, and I've used it very successfully to put branches where you want. And that's the advantage, is you're really telling the tree where you want these branches. The other technique would be to remove all the branches, have a bare trunk. It would, if it's healthy enough, it will sprout new shoots, but then the tree dictates where it wants new shoots. Whereas this technique, you're saying, I want one exactly on the outside of this bend because it's aesthetically pleasing, on the outside of this bend, etc. So what will happen is either during the growing season or in the next season, you'll get to this point where you've got the growth here. So this is the shoot that was pointed in this direction. This is still attached to the tree. You've got this part here, it will look very weak. This one will be much thicker. At this point, you can then sever this. Now, you don't want to cut it straight off at that point. You want to probably do it about an inch further back. If you're doing it on quite a thick branch, and maybe you're not sure about how strong this is, you maybe want to just take a little bit of, say, half the thickness of that branch off and let it weaken there, and it'll draw even more up here and get stronger before you separate it. But what you want to see is a difference in thickness before making that cut. Right, pests and diseases. So the main ones I've seen, aphids on new growth, horrible things. Mites, I had a big problem a couple of years ago with mites, and they tend to hide in little nooks and crannies within a tree, especially I found in between branches, right in the crotch, and also in areas where a branch has been removed and it's callousing. And what you'll see in spring are these little eggs, and then it grow into bigger mites. Not this big, they're still very, very small little things, but you can usually tell by the orange coloration. So usually, I think we worked out that it was mainly hot, dry summers, and it was that then you get a lot of mites the next season. And that's what we had probably about 2-3 years ago. and I had a whole infestation. Luckily, I caught it in time. I know there's some other people around that sort of had some trees lose their branches because of it. What they'll do is they'll just sit in those areas that are a little bit hidden. Maybe there's some new growth in there, and they'll just eat away and weaken the tree. Scale insect as well. So they look like little raised plates. Get red spider mite, and then horrible vine weevil. So this is the adult. If you see any of these around your pot, I apologize now, but squish them. Just, they make a very satisfying sound. And vine weevil is what really does the damage. So what they will do is the vine weevil will come along, get to your tree, lay its eggs. Those eggs will hatch into these larvae. These larvae want to eat something, and the nearest food source are your lovely roots that you're spending years and years trying to cultivate. And you can lose trees to vine weevil infestation. So just, you can watch out for it. There's two ways to deal with vine weevil. One is when you're repotting, if you notice them, is have a really good repot. Take your time, rake out as many roots as you can so you can get rid of them all, and then squish them. Or the other way is you can get Bravado vine weevil killer, and then you either water it on a tree or dunk it. And I prefer dunking it because you don't use as much of it as you do when you're watering on, and it makes sure that the whole root ball is completely soaked in this, and then it gets rid of them. In terms of other things, I'm personally more of a chemical intervention for a lot of them. Stuff like aphids, if there's only a few, I'll take them off with my fingers. In terms of mites, I have sprayed them with jet of water to get rid of them, but ultimately they'll probably just end up going to another tree. So what I use a lot of the time is a systemic insecticide, and it gets rid of most of these problems. Unfortunately, it's sometimes a little bit more difficult to get hold of really good stuff now, but especially something like either red spider mite or mites, make sure you look for an insecticide that deals with mites. You'll need that. Okay, so let's go on to maple bonsai styles. Really is applicable for pretty much every bonsai style of maple. So you've got twin trunks, multiple trunks, which I love. I think they're great style for maple bonsai, especially when you've got a very nicely spreading root base. You've got broom style, which again works very, very well. And you've got forest. So this is a nice little trident maple forest on a slab. Some other styles are semi-cascade, even full cascade can work well. You've either got informal upright or formal. This is kind of a in between. I couldn't find a straightforward formal upright maple picture quite so easily. You've got trident maple here, which is exposed root style, a little bit more unusual. It's not as common. And then root over rock, which especially this one's a trident maple. It tends to work well because those tend to callus and swell and give you quite a pleasing synergy between the rock and the tree itself. So what about maple pots? Personally, I like to use glazed pots. I like to use quite muted colours. I like to have quite light colours, just cream to an almost white, but smoky white colour. Also lighter blues, but I think these kind of colours complement the tree well. So this one's quite a famous tree by Walter Pahl in Germany. It's quite a big tree, but you can see it's an oval and it seems to work very well stylistically with this tree. Or soft rectangle trees, soft rectangle pots, maybe sort of a fluted or rectangle pot with the corners cut out of it seem to work well. So let's just spend a little bit of time going through the different varieties that we can use. in bonsai. So this is just a straightforward Ace palmatum Japanese maple. Again, a really very, very pretty specimen here. You can see the types of foliage here. I'm guessing, looking at that colour, that maybe is actually Deshojo variety, which I'll show you in a minute, because you've got a little bit more of a reddish tinge to the leaves as they're coming out. Then you've got very small trees here, so this one's going to be quite a large tree, you can tell by the ramification, but you can have very small trees as well. It's suited quite well to that. Trident maple, again, it's one of the classic bonsai species. It's called a trident maple because it's got 3 leaves, where the palmate, it's like a palm, it's got 5 fingers. So it's a little bit coarser growth. So very, very small mame or shohin trees. A little bit more tricky with trident maples, partly because they're vigorous and partly because the growth is a little bit more coarse. But it is doable if you've got good technique to have a small sized tree. So as I was mentioning, Deshojo, they're very, very pretty in spring. They come out in this beautiful red colour. Also, this one here is a Sagan, I believe, which again has got a beautiful red colour in spring. Sagan, especially the older varieties of it, were quite weak trees and weren't used quite so much for bonsai. They're beautiful, but they were a bit problematic. But I believe the more newer varieties of Sagan are a little bit stronger. So I think, well, I haven't seen that many around. The Deshojo is very common. Sagan is a less common species you get around, but they're very, very pretty trees. So as I was mentioning before, Arakawa, it's a rough barked maple, so it's a cork bark maple, and usually they're quite sparse trees. This one's actually a very well ramified specimen, and that's just showing you what beautiful bark it's got, and really that's the feature for this tree, is to have this corky bark. Whoops. Another species is Shishigashira, and again it takes quite a while to get a very well ramified and a mature tree. So this one is very, very well ramified for Shishigashira, and you can tell it's quite a different leaf type. It's still a palmate, it's got 5 lobes, but you've got, it kind of crisps up on itself, the leaves, and they look very different, but nonetheless it's very pretty, well thought of and sought after species of maple. I decided to put one of my trees in here. The rest of these, I have to say, are not my trees, but this one here is one you've probably seen if you go to the Swindon show. It's a Kiyohime maple. And you see here what I was mentioning about sort of a more muted white colour. This is a wonderful Dan-Barton pots that I got him to make specifically for this tree, and it's got sort of scalloped out corners to take a little bit of the harshness out of it, and also it's quite smoky down the bottom, and apart from just being pretty, it also gives the pot slightly less visual weight, because you've got the very bottom here is sort of a dark color, and then this bleeds into it, so you can take quite a lot of the weight out of the visual effect of a pot by having this kind of dark band towards the bottom of the pot. So Kiyohime maple is a little bit different in terms of its habit. So normally trees would want to grow straight upwards in terms of maples. This one's different. It's called basally dominant, which means that it wants to put most of its growth out this direction. So actually it's really suited to this broom style. And if you take a normal Kiyohime maple and put it in your garden as a rockery plant or whatever, it'll naturally have this habit. So you're not fighting the tree in that respect. But what you've got to do is remember that it's stronger around here than here. So if you were doing it like a normal tree, you would probably prune quite hard around the crown. But if you did that and you let these grow out, because this is stronger, the growth out in these directions, you actually can weaken the crown to the point where you actually might start losing branches. So you've got to remember that you need to prune it harder at these lower branches and maybe less so at the crown. Okay, Benishidori, as you can see, this is a wonderful specimen, and I don't mean Graham Potter. So I took this off his website because Benishidori again is another variety that's a little bit less common, but this is a really magnificent specimen, and it comes out in this kind of like peachy colour in spring. And there's another variety I haven't mentioned, but Katsura is quite similar as well, and it comes out in lovely colour in spring. And it's one of the joys of spring is when the trees start to grow and you get this really quite brilliant coloured foliage. That's why people who are into maples get lots of different ones, because you get lots of different colours through the whole of spring and autumn as well. So there's a few species that are used that are less common, one of them being Acer rubrum. As you can see from the leaf, it's a little bit more coarse, and the whole growth habit is a little bit more coarse, so you can't get quite the defined tree that you would do with something like a Japanese maple. Acer grisseum, also known as paperbark maple. So you can see a close-up here of the bark on a paperbark maple. So this is a mature tree, and it's really grown for its paper bark. But obviously it will take quite a long time for a maple in a bonsai pot to get that kind of bark. And also, as you can see from the growth habit, it's quite coarse, it's upward growing. So again, it's why it's not used quite so commonly in bonsai horticulture. Okay, so in terms of reference books, these are the ones that I can recommend. In fact, I've got copies of them right next to me. So the first one is by Peter Adams, who unfortunately is no longer with us, but he's written some wonderful books in his time. I think he brought out a Japanese maples book. It probably was in the 80s or early 90s, and it was really difficult to get hold of it. But he thankfully revamped and reissued it in the early 2000s, and I believe it's probably still quite difficult to get hold of a copy. Luckily, I've got one when it first came out, but it's a very good book. There's some wonderful drawings in that he did himself. If you know Peter Adams, he was famous both for being a good bonsai artist, but also a good artist who could show you what trees would look like in the future, or you could see what was a tree would look like and give you an idea of where to go. This one in the middle, I can't recommend it highly enough. It's not a cheap book at all. I think it's around about £90, and it's sometimes quite difficult to get hold of. I believe Greenwood's and Corin's got some copies of this, or there's some coming over. But I think it's about 400 pages with tons and tons and tons of pictures, and just it's amazing. You know, I got it, and I'm still reading through it and picking up stuff. So if you're really serious about maples, that is the one book I would recommend. It's brilliant. If you're into maples in general, then this is kind of the Bible of the trees. It shows all the different varieties, what their habits are. So if you're trying to work out which trees you want to get hold of, either for bonsai or just in general, everything pretty much is in there. So it's a very worthwhile book if you're very much into just maples in general. So I'll finish off with where I get my information from, either books, magazines, but there's also some good online references. Lee's got a very good section on several different species, one of them being maple. And as a club at Newbury, we have him, until obviously lockdown, we had him twice a year coming in giving workshops, and he's just such a knowledgeable person and very good at imparting that knowledge. And we have workshops with him and we work on the trees, and working on the trees is good and is brilliant, but you could literally just sit in and listen to him just talk about trees and what to do and just pick up so much information. So I very much highly rate Lee, and he's got some good stuff on his website. Also, Harry's website, Bonsai for Me, got some great stuff on it, and got both species information here. So if you're ever wondering how to deal with a new species, he's got a very, very good section on there. So I recommend that. I'm also looking at some really good channels on YouTube. I think there's some great content out there now. Peter Warren's done some absolutely brilliant online videos. Bjornholm, I think his name is. He's doing some really good stuff, and he's very good with maples. So I encourage you to have a look at some of his videos. And that is pretty much me over. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm very happy to take any questions.